This is an interview with Ron Waldman on July 11th, 2008, at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, about his role in the Smallpox Eradication Project. The interviewer is Alyssa Koski. With this interview, we're hoping to capture for future generations the memories of participants and their families involved in eradicating smallpox. This is an incredibly important and historic achievement, and we want to hear about your experience. I have some questions to guide you, but please feel free to recount any special stories or anecdotes that you remember about events or people. The legal agreement you just signed says that you are donating the oral history to the U.S. federal government, and it will be in the public domain. For the record, could you please state your full name and that you know you are being recorded?
Ron Waldman. Yes, I know I'm being recorded.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks again for being here today. I just want to start with a few chronological questions. If you could describe for me briefly your childhood, your college education, and what influenced you to become interested in public health in general.
Well, my childhood was spent in New York City and then in Long Beach, New York, where I graduated from high school. I went to college at the University of Rochester in upstate New York, and then to law school at the University of Chicago in 1967, where I studied for 1 year until I left the U.S. during a period when many people my age then were leaving out of objections to the Vietnam War. And I ended up in medical school at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. I can't honestly say that while there I had any exposure to public health at all. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do in medicine with my medical degree when it was awarded to me, somewhat surprisingly, in 1975, in May of 1975. Being a foreigner in Switzerland at that time meant that without having the benefit anymore of a student permit to live there, I had to leave the country, and I really didn't have much knowledge of what I was going to do. While there, I had been coaching a high school baseball team, and I was talking one day to my star pitcher from the team, who was graduating from the international school in Geneva at the time, and we were talking about what we were going to do. I asked him what he was going to do, and he said he was going to go out to Colorado to ski. And he asked me what I was going to do, and I said I didn't have any idea, but I had just finished the medical school at the university, and I would probably end up doing something related to medicine. And he said, "Oh, that's pretty interesting. You ought to meet my girlfriend." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, her dad works with the World Health Organization." I said, "Okay, we'll bring her to the next game." So he came to the next game accompanied by his girlfriend. And she said, "Well, you ought to go up and see my dad," and her dad turned out to be D.A. Henderson. So I went up to meet with him and was, long hair and all at the time, ushered up to the smallpox offices, where I don't remember exactly what happened, but the upshot of it was that they asked me if I could leave for Bangladesh within the next few days, and I said, sure. And that's how I got my introduction to public health and to smallpox, which has been basically was the beginning of a career that's still going on.
So quite an unanticipated chain of events.
Very serendipitous event, as had other previous events been. So, yeah, not the usual pathway into the program, I don't think. So I left as a I left for Bangladesh a few days after that meeting as a WHO volunteer. So smallpox eradication was really my first job of a serious nature. But I didn't get paid really any more than just the subsistence that WHO volunteers got at the time. I didn't know anyone who was working in public health. I didn't know what public health was. I'm sorry to say, and maybe it doesn't reflect well on the very strong academic program at the University of Geneva Medical School, but I hadn't really heard of smallpox. And I'm not entirely sure that I had heard of Bangladesh either. But there I went.
Quite the adventure you're beginning. Can you tell me a little bit about your arrival there in Bangladesh and...
Yeah, we went, I remember leaving Geneva and we were heading off for training in Delhi. I remember distinctly flying into Delhi, and when they opened the door of the plane, there was this rush of heat that I had never experienced before in my life, and I knew I was somewhere different. We had a small orientation group there in India. I remember some of the people who were in that group with whom I'm still good friends. I think that orientation took about 5 days. Some people stayed in India, others were sent on to Bangladesh. That's where the action was. And I remember that first plane trip to Bangladesh. I never thought I was going to land at all. It was May, the beginning of the monsoon season. And the plane flew over Dhaka, tried to land. Storms came in, the plane was rocking. It was just awful. For about an hour, they kept circling around and trying to land. They couldn't. And eventually, the plane went back to Calcutta, where we spent the night. This was all like in the fog of all of this newness happening to me. We were forced to spend the night in Calcutta, got out the next day. They took us to the airport, put us on a plane again, and flew us off to Dhaka, where this time we landed. And we were greeted by Danielle Tarantola, who was, I don't know exactly what, but high up in the smallpox bureaucracy in Bangladesh, and taken into another orientation session that lasted about a week. Again, that's where I made all these acquaintances, and many of which were with people that I'm still in regular contact with, as I am with Danielle just now. At the end of that orientation, where they were talking about things like impressed accounts and administrative matters and stuff that I really didn't understand and in which I had, frankly, little interest, they shipped me off. I was young, and there were a few of us, a number of volunteers like myself. They shipped me off to the northeastern corner of the country, Sylhet district, and there I went. I went from Sylhet, the smallpox base in Sylhet. They shipped me off even further towards the Indian border to a upazila, I think they're called now, a Thana called Chatak, a town called Chatak, where there were no roads. They had given me an outboard motor. I had no experience with motorboats, but they gave me an outdoor motor. I carried it up there on my back, found a boat, found a driver, and started doing what they had instructed me to do, which was to conduct surveillance activities.
You mentioned that you traveled farther outside of your central village and had an outboard motor. Can you tell me a little bit about what travel was like? Did you have a team with you?
I had one person with me, basically, a driver who I had hired. I located up there. This was a place, it was really far out, and it was in many ways, but it was a place that had a big paper pulp factory that was run by an Eastern European country. And when I got up there, I didn't speak the language or anything, but I went over there, and with a translator, I had a translator, and just to find out somebody who could drive me around in this motorboat. And we located a guy who just turned out to be fantastic and who literally saved my life a number of times. He had been a freedom fighter during the Bangladeshi War of Independence, and those guys, Rocky Bahini they were called, were very highly respected by everyone. This was a guy of indeterminate age, I would say. He had a long, flowing white beard, but I don't think he was very old. He was probably in his 40s or early 50s. And he attached himself to me, and when we explained what I was there to do and what the program was about, and became a very, very loyal, faithful, dedicated, and incredibly competent colleague. we went around with flyers and posters and obviously had supplies of vaccine, bifurcated needles, everything else that we needed to control outbreaks of smallpox. Should we find them, we went around to, there were no roads, literally. We only had the rivers to follow, and then when enough rain had fallen, and as I mentioned, we were on the Indian border, and when they created Bangladesh, the surveyors establishing the boundaries would walk and walk and walk, and as soon as they took a step up, that's where they drew the border. So Bangladesh was completely flat, and there was no rock to build with. So all of the stones for construction came from the Indian side of the border, and they would carry them along the rivers in these long, I don't know, canoe-like boats that they would load with rock until there was no freeboard whatsoever on the side of the boat. They were going with the tops of their boats flush with the water line. Why not? There wasn't really any motorized traffic in these areas until I came along with my motorboat. So I basically held their lives in my hand. My driver did, because if we had created wake going past them with their boats filled with rock, they were going down. So the upshot of it was that basically I was king of the river, you know, or my driver. So it was really kind of, we went everywhere like that. We went to marketplaces, mosques, other gathering places, every little village we could find. After it had rained enough, we could go straight as the crow flies. We didn't have to stay to the course of the rivers. The rice paddies filled with water, and the whole place was underwater. I remember that we would just go straight from one point to another. Sometimes they had these little dikes between the rice paddies, and sometimes we would hit our motor up against those dikes, and we would break off what's called a shearing pin that keeps the propeller in place. So we always had to have a hefty stock of shearing pins whenever we traveled. I remember that, and I remember having to change them quite a number of times. As time went by, I learned how to deal with the boat, and I learned enough of the language to get by, so that on the weekends when we would go down to Sylhet to get a little R&R for a day or so with the other smallpox workers from the region, I used to take the boat down myself. I'd leave the driver up at home with his family, and I used to go down probably about a 3-hour ride with this little, maybe 30 horsepower Yamaha engine that we had. So I got to be pretty good with a motorboat, in addition to smallpox. And you know, by now many people must have explained what the deal was. We would ask if people, we had these recognition cards that the WHO had given us, and we'd show them around, and we would invite people to tell us if they had seen anybody with a rash that led them to suspect that this person might have smallpox, and then we would go out to that place, to the person's house. We'd try to get us enough information to know where it was, and if indeed we identified the patient as a person who had smallpox, we would institute containment activities, which meant that we would isolate the patient in the home, hire guards from the village to make sure that no one could come in or out of the person's hut. And we began a vaccination routine. That's when we started hiring people. And we would round up as many people as we could. They were usually younger kids who were interested, at least interested in earning the pittance that we were paying them. 6 taka a day, I remember. It was really, wasn't very much money. And they would begin to vaccinate. We'd instruct them in how to vaccinate, and they would begin vaccinating everybody. I don't remember exactly what the protocol was, but it was maybe within the first day to vaccinate everybody within a 100-meter radius of the index case, and then within 5 days, maybe 300-meter radius or 500-meter radius, and eventually up to a kilometer around the case. For us, it wasn't difficult at all, because this was a pretty sparsely populated rural area, and as I mentioned, everything was water. So the little villages, if you could call them that, the clusters of homes, were all on little islands, basically, that just were slightly elevated above the water. So we would, maybe there'd be 10 or 20 or homes or something like that. So we'd do a clump of those and vaccinate everybody, and then just get back in the boat and go to the next one and get out and explain what we were doing there and vaccinate everybody. So it really wasn't, for me, all that many people. On the other hand, we had a lot of smallpox. So out of all the people that you'll be talking to, I've seen as many cases of smallpox as anyone. You know, this happened, I think it was in March or April or maybe early May in Bangladesh. The government knocked down the slums in the capital city of Dhaka, and when they did that, people fled back to their home villages, and they transported diseases all over the country doing that. I know it's a big event that the WHO people really tried, and CDC people really tried to get the government not to do this, but the government was intent on knocking down these slums, and they did. And because then when smallpox was carried throughout the country, that's when they had this huge resurgence. They had been doing quite well in bringing it under control, but in that spring of 1975, there was a huge resurgence in the number of cases, which is why, coming full circle, they were so interested in taking anybody who would go, basically, and sending them out there. So when I turned up on the basis of DA's daughter's recommendation at the offices in WHO, they were really happy to see a warm body who was willing to go out there. They were throwing everything into trying to bring the epidemiological situation back under control.
Very interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about your reception in some of these small villages, or as you call them, like clusters of homes, in combination with the social circumstances at the time? Were there ever any challenges that arose for you?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and one that my answer will maybe be a little bit controversial, and has been at other meetings of smallpox people. One of the reasons why the smallpox eradication effort in countries like Bangladesh was so successful was that those of us working in the program were fanatically committed to its success. I think that the tone was set by those people who were leaders in Bangladesh. For us, it was Stan Foster, Danielle Tarantola, a number of others, people from the CDC. But we were going to get this job done. And I can't even tell you with tremendous accuracy what the reception was always. Sometimes it was quite warm. We were always invited. I remember before we did anything, when we arrived there, and remember I was traveling with a guy who was incredibly respected in society there and who everyone knew. But we were always asked to take a seat, that we were always offered green coconuts and the coconut water. We were offered tea, always whatever little bit they had to offer guests, we were always offered right off the bat, and the hospitality was incredible. When it came to doing the job, if it meant isolating somebody in a home, if it meant vaccinating people who might not want to be vaccinated for one reason or another, the reception could become at times a little cooler, but it never really dissuaded us from getting the job done. So there were times when things were done even forcibly. People tried to flee when it was their turn to be vaccinated because they were afraid of what it might be, and it was never, I don't think, altogether adequately explained to people. Or maybe it was, and they didn't understand. They could be at times physically restrained and forcibly vaccinated. So I have a very deep and abiding interest in human rights and in the relationship between communicable disease control and human rights. But I have to say that, at least from my personal experiences in Bangladesh, there were times when one could be questioned about one's respect for other people's rights to have a particular intervention explained to them. And I know that this was the case in India as well, and there are some papers in the literature that talk about this. There were times I was very friendly because I had this big motorboat. Not big, but I had a motorboat, which was unusual for the area. So the military forces would come by at times and, just to see what I was up to, because I had something that could be of value to them under certain circumstances. So I was kind of friends with the military, and people knew that, and it was interesting. But we always got the job done, and I really, really hope that we did it with the maximal amount of explaining to people what we were after, and to the largest degree possible with their assent, their accord.
I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about your relationship with your guide. It sounds like he was an incredible asset to your whole experience there. And you mentioned really early in our conversation that there were a couple of times when he may have even saved your life.
Yeah.
Could you discuss that a little bit more?
Well, sure. So, he was Iraqi Bahini. These were the Bangladeshi liberation fighters during the war of separation of independence, Bangladesh independence, from Pakistan, which was in 1971 and 1972. These are guys who, that war was terrible, as wars are in that part of the world, in any part of the world. And the Pakistani forces would pillage villages, rape women, and so on and so forth. And the major resistance was in the peripheral areas where these, I guess you could call them to a certain extent guerrilla fighters who would do what they could to resist hit and run activities, just, sabotage and whatever. These are guys who would, when they were being chased, they would stay underwater. The apocryphal stories are that they would stay underwater for 12 or 24 hours at a time, breathing through a reed that they, would have plucked from the brush on the side of the river. So they were legendary. And he happened to be a part of that. And in the post-independence days, they could pretty much do what they wanted. And he was just a really upstanding guy who wanted to continue to provide service to the people and the country that he loved. And he was very, very happy to hook up with the Smallpox Eradication Program. I don't remember if he had relatives who had died of smallpox, but everybody knew people who had smallpox. It was a fairly common disease in that part of the world. So yeah, I was really lucky that I had him, because I'm sure I could have made some serious diplomatic faux pas, and probably did, and I'm sure I don't know of all the many times that he protected me, actually. But I did say that, there are times when he did save my life, and that's true, because, as I said, I didn't really know what I was doing with the motorboat at all, and I would go and, get in trouble with it a lot of the time. And I remember one time leaving, I lived in a guest house on one part of this town of Chatak, and he lived on the other side of the town, and along the river still. But I remember I took the boat out one evening just to go for a little spin, and it stalled. It was a big river we were on, the Surma River. And I took the boat out, and I didn't know what I was doing, and the motor stalled out, and I got caught in the current, and I was going down the river, to places I didn't know. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know where I was going to end up or how I was going to get out of it. But I just remember as I was going down past where he lived, I was waving my arms and everything, and somehow he was there and he saw me. I don't know how. And he hopped into a canoe-like thing and paddled out to the motorboat and got it started and took me home. And it was dark by then. I was, I remember I was a little scared, but I remember him coming to the rescue. So.
Great story. Can you tell me anything about your relationships with other country counterparts? Your relationship with the other WHO team members, CDC team members.
Yeah, in terms of the country counterparts, I didn't have, in that iteration, I later was transferred, actually maybe I was transferred because of this incident that I might recount now. So I was up there for about 5 or 6 months in that part, and then I was transferred down. Then, you know, smallpox was over, and I was assigned to an area that was on the Bay of Bengal, so in the southern part of the country, Noakhali it was called. My relations with the Bangladeshi Ministry of Health officials who were up there in Chatak, my first posting, were not so great. I remember, you know, we worked a lot of people who've been working in the malaria program came over and were assigned to smallpox. And for the most part, the ones that I had to deal with were not district, maybe they were malaria people, but I remember there were some district medical officers. And remember, this is my first job ever, and I was, you know, we were focused. This is what we wanted to do. And my impression is that, as I remember it now, is that I wasn't impressed with their dedication to their job. I thought that they were not working hard enough to get the job done. I thought that they could have been doing a lot more. And basically, I didn't have so much respect for their competence. I mean, now I've been working in global health ever since then. So for the past 30 some odd years more. And I know a lot of things now that I should have known then, about how much they were being paid, how they had to do other things to earn a living, to support their families. I didn't have any of these things. I had never had a paying job and still didn't have a paying job. I didn't have a family. I had nothing but smallpox eradication. And I went in and I suspect that I was probably an imperious, you know, self-centered, uncaring foreigner who didn't know anything about the place where I was working. I didn't even have an appreciation for learning the culture or having an understanding of the history of a place. I mean, I was a young kid, brash, brazen, and interested in only one thing, which was getting the job done that I was there to do as quickly and as effectively as possible. And you know, I was probably pretty obnoxious. You know. On the other hand, there were things that, in the way that I was treated there also, that were pretty annoying. And people will tell you Bangladeshis have this strange habit that I've really never seen anyplace else, of staring and gathering around foreigners and staring at them, and, you know, sometimes poking and just, you know, they don't have the same, at least then, or at least my perception then, they didn't have the same respect for individual space, you know, that we have. So, you know, on top of that, I'm left-handed, and they eat with their hands, and I ate with my left hand, which wasn't a really cool thing to do in a society like that. And, you know, I remember I had to go out to a restaurant in town. I always went to the same place every night to eat the small amount that there was to eat. But people would come, and you know, I'd be trying to eat, and people would, you know, you'd have a crowd around you because they didn't see so many foreigners standing there, looking, staring at you, what you were doing. And I'd be eating, and I'd be eating with the wrong hand, and eventually the restaurant owner took pity on me and built a small little, you know, put a curtain up in a corner of the restaurant. That would be my area where I could go and eat in peace. So it was tough. It was a lot of pressure on me. It was a strange environment. It was my first job, and so on and so forth. And it got, you know, at times a little lonely up there. I was on my own in terms of, you know, WHO team, and it was tremendous. Just a phenomenal learning experience that I tried to handle as well as possible. And I'm very happy that we got the job done. I'm very happy to have had that experience and to have grown so much from it, to have learned from it. and to have launched my career there, and I've had a great career since then. So that was good. In terms of other people from WHO, there was another guy like me, a young, I think he's going to be here this weekend, in the Tana next door, much bigger Tana called. Most of us had, I forget what the words, the administrative areas were called, the equivalent of a province or a region or something. And most of the people were assigned to, a region of a country that contained a number of districts. I had one district under my, in my area of supervision, because it was a large district and it was so difficult to get around. But there was a guy in the one next door called Sunamganj that, who had the same job as I did. And we would get together occasionally. Not all that often, because it was probably an hour down the big river between us, and an hour one way and an hour back the other way against the current. It's a lot. We did get together, as I mentioned, on weekends, probably about 8 or 10 people. Steve Jones was the sort of overall supervisor of all of us working in that area, and we would go down to his place in the center of Sylhet and meet up for a weekend.
Did you find it helpful to have a group of people that you could sort of commune with, to share your experiences with, who are also foreigners doing the same type of job? And what sort of things did you do when you got together?
Yeah. Yeah, I found it great. And, it was a good break from the field. I think we went every 2 weeks. It was a good break from the field. It was only a couple of days, which was fine, because after a day you wanted to get back to the field and back to work anyway. But it was a nice house, and it had a roof, I remember. We used to sit up on the roof. And, if somebody got their hands on a couple of cans of beer or a bottle of whiskey or some marijuana or whatever it was, we would have a nice little time. And it was a good break. And then we'd go back to work. But we really only went down to Dhaka very, very rarely, maybe. Maybe I went, and the whole time I was up there twice at the most, except that in the middle of all of this, I had mentioned my relationship with the military. In the middle of all this, the president of the country, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, was assassinated by a military coup. And there was basically a lockdown every place. And they came because they knew where I was and took my boat, because they needed it to get around. So that was a little scary too, because we communicated with the center by radio, walkie-talkie, and communications were down. They took my boat. I had, it was a little scary for a little while, but I don't remember how eventually I got down to Dhaka, but I know that during that period we were all called back in, and I know that I got there somehow, so that was okay.
I'd like to talk a little bit about how your experiences in Bangladesh impacted the rest of your life, and as you said, it started you on a long career in public health.
Yeah, it sure did. I mean, I did that while I was there. Obviously, I met a lot of the people from here, from the CDC, who had gone out there. Some people were there for long times, like Stan and Steve Jones. They were doing, they stayed in smallpox for a while. Other people, a lot of people came through on a regular basis from the CDC. We used to call them 90-day wonders. Those, those of us who were the hippie volunteers in the field, after a month or so, you were a veteran, and you knew what you were doing, and you were totally experienced. And here came these new coming, guys from the EIS or whatever, and they were going to come out for 3 months, where we had all made 2-year commitments or more. And we just, big hotshot docs from the U.S., and we used to look down on them a lot and try to make fun of them whenever we could. So we called them 90-day wonders. I remember I met a lot of them and asked them questions like you're asking me. Why'd you get into public health? What are you doing? Do you like it? And I liked a lot of them, and they liked me. And before I left, they asked if I would consider joining the EIS program. And I said, yeah, let me in. It sounds great. I had finally found my calling. This is really what I wanted to do, was the kind of stuff I was doing, the field work that I was doing in Bangladesh.
Sure. I was just asking about how your experiences in Bangladesh influenced your subsequent career in public health.
So I met a lot of people from the CDC, and I liked them. They liked me. And before I left, they asked if I would consider joining the EIS. I said, sure. But I remember didn't have any internship. I had just graduated from medical school and I had my degree. So it was a requirement that you had to do an internship. So eventually when I left smallpox, I guess it was in '77, I went back to the States, where I hadn't been in some time, almost 10 years. And I did an internship, and then I liked that. So I stayed another year, and I started doing a residency in internal medicine. But then I started not liking it so much. But what I did was I called D.A. Henderson. I went to Johns Hopkins after having contacted DA again, and I got my master's public health degree. They had then a preventive medicine program, and the second year of their preventive medicine program that I was in, they would place the students with state and county health departments and things like that. So I remember that the chief resident, the head of that residency program, asked me, well, Ron, for your practicum, how'd you like to go work with the EIS officer in Maryland? And that sort of triggered my memories of EIS. They were, I was a student, I was paying them for the privilege. And here they wanted me to go and work alongside of whoever the EIS officer was, who was making what was a not bad salary. So I basically said, listen, that reminds me, I don't want to work with the EIS officer. I can be the EIS officer. And I applied to the EIS that year and got in, and there you have it. I was assigned to the state of Michigan to do my EIS. And at that time, I was one of the few people in the EIS class that had substantial overseas international experience. My Bangladesh experience, but I don't know if they counted my Switzerland experience or not. I don't know. But early on, they asked me if I wanted to go and work in the Cambodian crisis. The genocide from Cambodia had resulted in large numbers of people fleeing to Thailand. And they asked if I would head a team from CDC they asked if I would work as an epidemiologist on a team of people going out there. And for a number of reasons, I didn't want to do that, so I didn't go. I was involved in other stuff in Michigan, actually. But a few months later, there was a crisis, a refugee crisis in Somalia. And they asked me again. The CDC had very good ties with Somalia because it was the last country that had smallpox. And there was a guy there in particular named Abdullahi Dirya who had been instrumental in the Somalia efforts to control smallpox, and he had friends, Bill Foege notably at the CDC. And they asked me if I would head a team going out to Somalia. And by that time, I had things in Michigan under better control, and I was happy to do that. So I went out to Somalia for about 3 months, and we organized things with the Ministry of Health. Now I really had the benefit of much more experience than I did the first time I had done this, and we did a pretty darn good job. Some people came over who I met who were excellent. We had a number of EIS officers. And we did a really good job there, organizing what was called the Refugee Health Unit at the Ministry of Health in Somalia. And it was actually the first time that we were able to undertake a series of fairly decent epidemiological studies that enabled us to define and describe the kinds of problems that refugees face when they are settled in refugee camps, as at that time was so often the case. And with other colleagues here and people that we brought in here afterwards, we really kind of developed the epidemiology of refugee health, and I did that for a long time. After EIS, I had gone to Somalia 2 or 3 times during EIS. Then I applied for a position here in what was called the International Health Program Office. And I was accepted into that, and I came down to Atlanta to work. But there was a reduction in force in the public health service, so they shipped me out to Somalia again. And I was there for another 6 months, and we developed primary health care programs and so on and so forth. But the point is that I basically stayed connected to the CDC here for about 5 years in the International Health Program Office. Eventually I became a division director in that office. Stan Foster there were 2 divisions. Stan Foster was the other division director on the country support side, and I was the head of the technical support division. We were implementing a program called Combating Childhood Communicable Diseases in 14 African countries, a program funded by USAID. So I was traveling all over the place and doing a variety of stuff. Before taking the division director job, I had been posted as an epidemiologist in Africa, so I was in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, for 3 years for the CDC as a regional epidemiologist in the context of this Combating Childhood Communicable Diseases, or triple CD program, as it was called. Interestingly, there were 3 of us in Africa, 3 regional epidemiologists, myself. There were 2 people during that time in then Zaire, and then in Malawi, David Heyman was posted, who had also been in smallpox in India, in West Bengal, at the same time that I had been in Bangladesh. So we were pretty close friends, and we still are to this day. After that, I stayed here until about, I don't know, 88, 89, something like that. And then I moved to Geneva to WHO and became eventually the head of the cholera program there. But continued doing refugee work, so I served in the, was asked to coordinate humanitarian assistance for CDC in the U.S. I was still at CDC. During the Gulf War, I was in northern Iraq and in Turkey, and then continued to work in these humanitarian crises. I was seconded by CDC to the UN to coordinate infectious disease control policy in Zaire after the Rwanda genocide in Goma, and just continued on. And eventually I built up a reputation here of getting very creative assignments. And in 1994, still on a CDC billet, I was actually assigned to the private sector to a company called John Snow Incorporated that is a contractor to USAID, and they had a very large child health program, $125 million program called Basics. And I was the technical director of that for a while. And then still on a CDC billet. I did that for about 5 years, and then I was asked to start this program at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. It is called still, the Program on Forced Migration and Health. And then I eventually retired from CDC, although now I'm working for USAID on pandemic preparedness. So yeah, that for initial experience not only exposed me to public health, but also exposed me to the CDC, where I've spent the better part of my career doing different things, all related, all directly involved in global health. And so I'm really grateful to have had that experience, because while I was in medical school, what I was entertaining most was becoming a thoracic surgeon, which sort of would have taken me in a different direction altogether.
A very different direction.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It sounds like, this experience with smallpox in Bangladesh certainly started off a very long and rewarding career in public health. And in closing, I just want to ask if there's anything else you would like to share, anything I didn't touch on that you would like to add to our discussion?
I guess the only thing that I would want to say in regard to smallpox eradication, it's really taught me a lot about programming, and I think that different people have different thoughts about not so much smallpox eradication, which everybody accepts as having been an inordinately successful program, but it spawned a number of other programs, and I think we need to learn from the smallpox experience, both the things that were good about it, but also the potential pitfalls that a program like this created, because it really was a big employment industry, if you will, smallpox. It went in and it really took control of a lot of ministries of health in a lot of poor and developing countries. And all the other programs that were going on in a country like Bangladesh or like India, I wouldn't say all, I don't want to exaggerate, but this really cut the legs out from a lot of other programs, because we took the personnel, we had the resources, we had the action, and we really set the agenda in a lot of these countries. And I think we have to learn from that, because from smallpox you had a lot of other things happening. One thing with obviously the guinea worm eradication program, the polio eradication program, soon there'll be a measles eradication program. And I think we have to learn that the most important thing that's come out of my experiences in my career for me is that people have a right to access health care for whatever their needs might be. And we have to make sure when we're undertaking these very singularly focused programs that we're doing it in a way that strengthens rather than weakens health systems in poor countries, where people can still go to a public health facility near where they live and make claims on that facility to meet their current health needs. Not everybody's going to require smallpox services. We should make sure that when these other programs are being implemented, and they're all good programs, that they're not cutting the legs out from under malaria control programs or diarrhea control programs or pneumonia control programs or whatever else it might be. Those things that are so important to people's health and their ability to survive, and towards meeting the overarching Millennium Development Goals that have been set for all of us working in public health.
Okay. Thank you again for sharing with us, and we appreciate it.
Thanks.